The Senate chamber, usually humming with the restrained murmur of debate, erupted in a flash of raw hostility. Rand Paul, face flushed crimson, leaned forward in his chair and let his words fly like a weapon. "You don't belong here." His voice cracked against the marble walls, sharp enough to silence the room in a single instant. Every head turned. Some froze in disbelief, others exchanged startled glances. The air seemed to thicken as the echo of those words clung to the chamber, ringing with centuries of exclusion and arrogance. Reporters lowered their pens for a heartbeat, their eyes wide. Aides stilled mid-step, the sound of their shoes abruptly halting on the polished floor. The chamber was no longer business as usual. It was the scene of an ambush. The camera lenses, trained with mechanical indifference only moments before, now locked in with predatory focus. Every angle caught the sneer etched across Paul's face, the dismissive curl of his lip, the calculated cruelty behind the insult. He wasn't just attacking a colleague. He was drawing a line in the sand, declaring who was allowed to have power and who wasn't. Jasmine Crockett sat steady, her expression unreadable, her posture composed. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze. And in that stillness, something extraordinary stirred, an unspoken defiance that sent a quiet tremor through the chamber. Senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to avert their eyes or brace for the storm they sensed was coming. Outside those walls, millions of Americans would soon watch this very moment replayed across screens, hashtags waiting to be born, emotions waiting to ignite. The insult was more than an attack on one woman. It was a strike at every voice that had ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, and accept their place. The silence stretched long enough to feel eternal, and in that silence, Paul's words seemed to grow heavier, darker, uglier. This was the kind of remark meant to wound, to belittle, to erase. Yet what he, and everyone else in that chamber, failed to realize was that the very words intended to diminish would become the spark that lit something far greater. Because no one in that chamber, not even Rand Paul himself, could have predicted how Jasmine Crockett would respond next. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. To some, it might have seemed like just another tense exchange in a chamber known for its heated debates. But to anyone who understood the gravity of history, it was clear. This moment was far bigger than a single insult. It wasn't just Rand Paul versus Jasmine Crockett. It was a question of who truly gets to belong in the halls of American power. 4 centuries. Those walls had echoed with voices that looked and sounded the same. White, male, privileged. The marble floors had borne the weight of decisions made by a narrow slice of America, often at the expense of those left outside the circle of power. To hear Paul's voice, dripping with exclusion, was to hear the echo of a long, ugly tradition. This place is not for you. Sit down. Stay in your place. But America had changed. Millions watching from living rooms and cell phones knew exactly what was at stake. They saw in Jasmine Crockett more than just a congresswoman. They saw a reflection of their mothers, sisters, daughters, neighbors, anyone who had ever been told they were unworthy of a seat at the table. They saw the weight of immigrant stories, of black resilience, of working-class grit carried into a chamber that was never designed for them. This wasn't just an attack on one woman. It was an attack on every voice ever told they didn't belong. The truth of that statement pulsed beneath the surface of the chamber. Crockett's silence in that moment was louder than Paul's scream. It carried centuries of struggle, centuries of defiance against the very arrogance that sought to exclude. And outside the chamber, people were already feeling it. Clips of Paul's outburst were making their way online within minutes. The captions wrote themselves. He said what? Who doesn't belong? America, watch this. Social media thrives on outrage, and here was a moment raw enough to spark a firestorm. The tension inside the Senate was now mirrored by the rising tide of voices beyond it, demanding to know who gets to decide who belongs in America's democracy. Yet the stakes went even deeper. Because belonging is not just about a seat in Congress. It's about who gets to shape laws, who gets to defend rights, Who gets to claim America as their own? Paul's insult was a reminder of the old guard's desperate attempt to cling to power by exclusion. Crockett's very presence, calm and unwavering, was proof of a new America, an America that would not be erased. Every heartbeat in that room seemed to carry the weight of this larger battle. Senators shifted uneasily, not just because of the outburst, but because they knew the cameras were rolling. They knew this wasn't going to stay contained within four walls. The world was watching. History was watching. And as Rand Paul leaned back in his chair, the faint smirk on his face betraying his belief that he had scored the upper hand, the truth was quite the opposite. Because what he had just unleashed was no longer under his control. The insult had become a mirror, showing America who he was and who Jasmine Crockett was destined to be in that moment. And that's when the mask of arrogance slipped further. To understand the weight of Rand Paul's outburst, you have to understand the man behind it. His words in that chamber were not a slip of the tongue, not a momentary lapse of judgment. They were the latest strike in a long career defined by obstruction, arrogance, and a brand of politics that thrives on belittlement. For years, Paul has carried himself with the smug assurance of someone who believes the rules bend to him. In hearings, he is infamous for his dismissive posture, leaning back in his chair, arms folded, eyes rolling, as if the testimonies of experts and colleagues were mere inconveniences. His questions are rarely questions at all. They're monologues, sharp with condescension, designed not to seek truth but to embarrass, to diminish, to score points for the cameras. Viewers who have followed his career know the pattern well. Whether sparring with scientists, dismissing civil rights concerns, or undermining colleagues with snide remarks, Paul's style has always been the same. Arrogance masquerading as intellect. He thrives on interruption, on cutting others short, on creating moments that leave him at the center of attention. In his world, power is measured not by substance, but by how many people you can talk over. And for too long, it worked. Too often, opponents, caught between outrage and restraint, let the moment pass. Too often, colleagues chose to ignore his antics, chalking them up to Rand being Rand. In that tolerance, his arrogance grew unchecked, morphing from sharp barbs into open disdain. Consider his clashes in public health hearings, where experts laid out sobering realities, only to be met with his smug, contrarian retorts. Time after time, he would roll his eyes, smirk for the cameras, and dismiss decades of expertise with a wave of his hand. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to perform, to belittle, to paint himself as the smartest man in the room, even as the facts collapsed around him. The danger of this pattern was not just in the insult itself, but in what it symbolized. Rand Paul's posture became the posture of exclusion. Your voice does not matter. Your experience does not matter. Only my arrogance has weight here. It was a performance rooted in hierarchy, the belief that authority should be protected by sneering at anyone who dares to challenge it. In Senate corridors, staffers whisper about his temper. In interviews, colleagues speak carefully, unwilling to provoke the wrath of a man who delights in turning disagreements into spectacles. To many, he has become less a legislator and more a showman, a repeat offender in the politics of belittlement. And, yet beneath the swagger lies something more fragile. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of a changing America where new voices rise, where women, people of color, immigrants, and the working class demand not just a seat in the room, but respect. His arrogance is the armor he wears against that inevitability. Each outburst, each insult, each eye roll is less about confidence and more about desperation to keep hold of a crumbling order. That desperation was written all over his face in that chamber. The redness in his cheeks, the shake in his voice, as he screamed, "You don't belong here," revealed what he never intended to show. Weakness. It was the cry of a man who sees his grip slipping, his old tricks no longer silencing the voices he wishes would disappear. For years, Rand Paul had gotten away with this routine, dismissing, obstructing, diminishing. He had thrived on it, built his brand on it, and relied on the silence of others to protect him. But arrogance has an expiration date, and when it finally collides with dignity, with truth, with unshakable composure, arrogance crumbles. For years, he had gotten away with this, but not today. To truly understand the magnitude of Jasmine Crockett's presence in that chamber, you have to trace the long, winding road that led her there. She wasn't born into wealth or privilege. She didn't inherit power, nor did she rely on the machinery of dynasty politics. Her rise was not a story of doors opened for her, but of doors slammed shut, until she learned how to kick them open herself. Crockett grew up in a world that often underestimated her, a world where ambition was supposed to have limits, especially for someone like her, a black woman from a modest background, without connections to grease the wheels of opportunity. From an early age, she learned what it felt like to be told no, not because of lack of ability, but because of the assumptions others cast on her. Yet every no became fuel. Every dismissal carved steel into her spirit. Education became her weapon. Crockett poured herself into her studies, sharpening not just her intellect, but her sense of justice. She saw early on how inequality wasn't an abstract concept debated in classrooms, but a daily reality shaping people's lives. Who got jobs, who went to prison, who had access to healthcare, who was silenced before they could even speak. Law wasn't just a career choice for her. It was a mission, a way to defend those who had been told they didn't belong. Her years as a civil rights attorney tested her resolve. She took on cases others wouldn't touch, standing beside the marginalized, the forgotten, the scapegoated. In courtrooms, she faced the same condescension she would later meet in Congress. Eye rolls, dismissive smirks, the insinuation that she was out of her depth. But case by case, win or lose, she built a reputation, not just as a fighter, but as someone who carried her client's dignity as if it were her own. Local activism became the next frontier. In community meetings and rallies, she wasn't the polished politician behind a podium. She was the daughter, the neighbor, the advocate who showed up when it mattered. People recognized something in her. Authenticity, yes, but also courage. She didn't speak from theory. She spoke from lived experience. She knew the frustration of being silenced, the exhaustion of being underestimated, the sting of systemic injustice. When she ran for office, skeptics lined up. They said she was too fiery, too bold, too unwilling to play by the quiet rules of politics. But Crockett's fire wasn't a liability. It was her strength. Voters didn't see a woman who needed to soften her edges. They saw a woman whose edges had been sharpened by the grindstone of survival. They sent her into the halls of power, not to blend in, but to shake them up. And shake them up she did. Her speeches cut through the fog of rehearsed talking points, reaching people not with platitudes, but with clarity. Her questions in hearings didn't posture, they pierced. Colleagues quickly learned she wasn't there to play the role assigned to her. She was there to redefine it, to represent not the narrow interests of a select few, but the broad hopes of those still waiting to be heard. Crockett's composure in the Senate chamber that day wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mask she put on for the cameras. It was the product of every courtroom glare she had endured, every town hall where she was interrupted, every door she had been told was closed to her. She didn't rise above Paul's scream because she had never been screamed at before. She rose above it because she had lived a lifetime of being told she didn't belong, and she had learned time and again that dignity speaks louder than arrogance. In her silence after Paul's outburst, there was a lifetime of defiance. It was the silence of a woman who had grown accustomed to walking into rooms not built for her and refusing to leave. It was the silence of someone who knew the cameras were watching, the country was watching, and that restraint could wound arrogance more deeply than rage. Her identity was not incidental to this moment. It was the heart of it. She stood in that chamber as a black woman, as a daughter of the working class, as a lawyer for the marginalized, as a representative for those who had never seen themselves in the Senate's polished marble. Her very presence was proof that America's promise of belonging was not the property of the privileged few, but the birthright of all. And in this moment, every battle she had fought prepared her for what came next. The silence after Rand Paul's outburst should have cooled the room, but instead, it ignited something volatile. He leaned forward again, as if silence itself were an insult to him, his voice rising louder with every sentence. Words spilled out, jagged and uncontrolled. Accusations and interruptions meant not to persuade, but to dominate. His gestures grew sharper, his face redder, his tone more desperate. What began as a calculated put-down was unraveling into a rant. The chamber felt it. The hum of whispered conversations returned, restless and uneasy. Staffers shifted in their seats, reporters scribbled faster, and even the senators closest to Paul avoided eye contact, as if to distance themselves from the spectacle. What was supposed to look like strength now looked like unraveling, but at the center of the storm, Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to interrupt. She let him burn through his fury, each shout ricocheting off the marble walls, only to collapse under its own weight. Her composure wasn't just silence, it was strategy. It was a mirror, forcing the chamber and soon the nation to see the contrast. One man unraveling, one woman unshaken. The cameras captured every detail. Paul's finger jabbing at the air, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. Crockett's steady gaze, her hands folded neatly before her, her stillness cutting deeper than any retort could. It was as if the air itself had shifted, thick with tension, alive with anticipation. The chamber wasn't just watching a debate, it was watching a test of wills. For Paul, the louder he shouted, the smaller he seemed. Each spike in volume revealed not authority, but fear. Fear of losing control of the narrative. Fear of a silence he couldn't fill. Fear of a woman who refused to play the role he had written for her. Deferential, diminished, erased. For Crockett, every second she remained calm was a declaration. It said more than words could. I will not be dragged into your chaos. I will not let arrogance dictate the tone of this chamber. I belong here, whether you accept it or not. The tension was unbearable, the air electric. Viewers at home leaned forward in their chairs, gripping their phones tighter, waiting for the inevitable. Because silence, as powerful as it was, could not last forever. The chamber buzzed with anticipation, the weight of history pressing in on everyone who sat within those walls. Paul leaned back for a moment, smirking as if convinced he had cowed his opponent. But beneath that smirk was the fragility of a man who mistook noise for power. The silence wasn't weakness, it was gathering force. Crockett had allowed him to expose himself, to display the full measure of his arrogance before she made her move. The room crackled, the kind of tension that precedes a thunderclap. Everyone could feel it coming. The reporters' pens stilled, the aides held their breath. The chamber collectively braced for the shift that was about to tear through the air. And then, in one devastating moment, Crockett struck back. For a moment, the chamber seemed suspended in time. Rand Paul's rant still echoed faintly against the marble walls, his words dissipating into an uneasy silence. He leaned back, chest heaving with self-satisfaction, convinced that his thunder had cowed his opponent. The smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth radiated arrogance. But in that stillness, Jasmine Crockett began to move. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she adjusted the microphone before her, a slow, deliberate gesture that drew every eye back to her seat. Reporters poised their pens, aides leaned forward, and the cameras zoomed in. The silence that Paul thought was his victory was about to become his undoing. Senator Paul, she began, her voice calm, steady, measured. It wasn't a counter-shout. It was sharper than that, a scalpel slicing through the bluster. You've raised your voice. You've made your accusations. But let's remind ourselves why we are here. The room stilled further. Her tone was not defensive, not meek. It was declarative, as if she were resetting the terms of the debate. Senators who had been fidgeting now sat upright. The audience sensed it too. This was the beginning of a dismantling. Crockett let the pause linger. Before she continued, each word precise, every phrase honed. We are not here to indulge tempers. We are not here to measure who can shout the loudest. We are here to represent the people who place their trust in us, people who don't have the luxury of throwing tantrums when they are told no. Gasps flickered across the room. Staffers scribbled furiously, capturing the cadence of her rebuke. Phones rose discreetly, capturing shaky, secret footage for the digital battlefield that awaited outside. Paul shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering as the spotlight he thought he owned shifted firmly away from him. She leaned forward, her voice softening but carrying even more weight. When you tell someone they don't belong here, you're not speaking to me alone. You're speaking to every daughter of immigrants who ever dreamed of this chamber. You're speaking to every black woman told she was too loud. Every working family told their voices didn't matter. You're speaking to America itself, and that's something you cannot shout down. The chamber stirred. Murmurs rose, a ripple of recognition spreading through the room. Senators glanced at one another, measuring the gravity of her words. Paul tapped his fingers against the table, eyes darting, the earlier certainty draining from his posture. He had come for dominance, but now he was shrinking under the weight of her calm precision. Crockett paused again, letting the silence expand. Then, with surgical exactness, she dismantled his earlier rant, point by point. You claim decorum, yet you violate it with volume. You demand respect, yet show none to those who serve alongside. You invoke the Constitution, yet you forget its very promise. That representation is not the privilege of the few, but the right of the many. Each phrase landed like a hammer. The audience could almost hear the collective gasp, the imagined, whispering from gallery seats. She's turning it back on him. Even the aides who usually filled the margins of these proceedings were scribbling notes with urgency, as though aware they were witnessing lines destined for history. Paul tried to interject, but Crockett raised a single hand, not in defiance, but in command, and the chamber obeyed. The interruption died in his throat, leaving him exposed. Her voice grew firmer. Senator, it's not disagreement I object to. It's dismissal. It's the arrogance of believing your voice is worth more than anyone else's. This chamber does not belong to one man's temper. It belongs to the people, and I, like every one of my colleagues, was sent here by them. The cameras caught, Paul blinking, his jaw tightening, his body leaning back as though the blows were no longer rhetorical but personal. His aura of command had collapsed into something brittle, fragile. What once looked like confidence now resembled cornered pride. Then came the line, the one that would echo beyond those walls, replayed in clips, quoted in headlines, repeated in classrooms and living rooms across the country. Crockett leaned into the microphone, her gaze unwavering. Senator, the only thing that doesn't belong here is arrogance without accountability. The chamber erupted, not in cheers, for decorum demanded restraint, but in something more profound, the stunned silence of a truth too sharp to ignore. Pens scratched furiously. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the air itself seemed charged, electric with recognition that a boundary had been crossed, a gauntlet thrown. Paul's face betrayed it all, the twitch of disbelief, the thin-lipped attempt to mask humiliation, the weight of cameras recording every micro-expression. He had come armed with bluster, but Crockett had answered with precision, turning his weapon back on him. And now he sat diminished, overshadowed by the woman he had tried to erase. In that moment, Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended everyone watching who had ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to accept exclusion as the price of daring to enter spaces of power. Her composure transformed into vindication, her words into a rallying cry. The chamber slowly began to breathe again. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, But the energy lingered, a recognition that something seismic had just taken place. For Paul, the moment was a wound he could not shout away. For Crockett, it was the mic drop of a lifetime. And outside those walls, the nation was already reacting. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take minutes. Within seconds of Jasmine Crockett's words cutting through the Senate chamber, the only thing that doesn't belong here is arrogance without accountability. The digital world had already ignited. Phones that had quietly recorded the exchange went live, streaming the clash across platforms before the echo of her final syllable had even faded. Twitter's trending, sidebar lit up like fireworks. Crockett clapback, belonging in America, Rand rattled. The phrases spread like wildfire, each hashtag gathering millions of impressions in real time. Clips of Paul shrinking back in his chair, eyes darting as Crockett's words landed, looped endlessly on TikTok and Instagram reels. Some videos racked up 500,000 views before the hour was out. Meme makers worked at lightning speed. One split screen showed Paul screaming, "You don't belong here," above Crockett's poised mic drop, captioned, "How it started versus how it's going." Another gif looped her lowering her hand to silence him, labeled simply, "Mum said no." Every platform, Facebook groups, Reddit threads, Discord servers buzzed with the same consensus. A new political moment had been minted. Late-night comedians wasted no time either. On one stage, a host imitated Paul's red face shouting before mimicking Crockett's calm reply, bringing the audience to their feet. Another show played the clip in slow motion, pausing right as Paul's smirk collapsed into discomfort, with the punchline, "The face you make when arrogance meets accountability." Laughter echoed coast to coast. But beneath the humor was something more powerful: recognition. Newsrooms scrambled to catch up. Cable hosts looped the footage during prime time. Hours, analysts, dissecting not just the exchange, but the symbolism. This wasn't merely a disagreement, one commentator said. It was the collision of two Americas, one clinging to exclusion, the other demanding belonging. Editorials sprang up overnight. A turning point for dignity in the Senate, when calm defeated chaos, the Crockett standard. But the most powerful voices weren't pundits. They were ordinary Americans. Teachers replayed the clip in classrooms, telling students, "This is how you handle a bully." Parents posted videos of their kids cheering as they watched Crockett's takedown, captions reading, "Representation matters." Immigrant families shared emotional threads, recounting moments when they'd been told they didn't belong, thanking Crockett for speaking their truth on the nation's grandest stage. Twitter timelines turned into rivers of validation. "I've never felt so seen. She didn't just defend herself, she defended us all. This is why we fight to stay in the room." One viral tweet with 1 million likes simply read, "Crockett didn't just clap back, she held up a mirror." Rand Paul, meanwhile, became the unwilling centerpiece of ridicule. Clips of his bluster were remixed with soundtracks of collapsing buildings, air horns, even children's tantrums. TikTok teens coined the phrase "pulling a Rand" to describe someone yelling only to be calmly destroyed moments later. Even some of his allies quietly admitted off-camera that his outburst had backfired spectacularly. The scale of the response felt less like gossip and more like a cultural earthquake. This wasn't a blip, it was a seismic jolt to the narrative of who gets to speak with authority in American politics. Crockett's moment crossed borders. British and Canadian papers ran stories. Commentators in India and Nigeria wrote op-eds hailing her as a global symbol of dignity meeting arrogance. She had become not just a senator, but a story. And yet, the most extraordinary part wasn't the jokes, the hashtags, or even the headlines. It was the quiet ripple effect, the whispered conversations in workplaces, the late-night texts between friends, the sigh of relief from those who had long felt excluded. People weren't just entertained. They were inspired. They saw themselves in her composure, her strength, her refusal to be shouted down. Crockett had not only silenced Paul, she had reignited something deeper. The idea that belonging isn't granted by gatekeepers, it's claimed by those who dare to stand their ground. But beyond the viral clips, something deeper emerged. When the headlines, the memes, and the laughter began to quiet, what remained was something far more enduring. Jasmine Crockett's words were not just a clever rebuttal, they were a reframing of the entire conversation. What Rand Paul had tried to reduce to a personal insult, she had elevated into a universal truth. In interviews following the clash, Crockett didn't bask in triumph. She didn't gloat or replay the moment as a victory lap. Instead, she reminded the nation why the exchange mattered. "This was never about me," she said. "It was about the people who sent me here, and about proving that in America, no voice belongs more than another." Her restraint mirrored the great reframers of American history, the leaders who understood that dignity is the most devastating weapon against arrogance. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a dream, he wasn't just countering segregation, he was reshaping the moral imagination of a country. When Shirley Chisholm claimed her seat in Congress, she wasn't just breaking barriers, she was declaring that the table itself must expand. Crockett, in her own way, had joined that lineage. Her confrontation with Paul became less about the spectacle of politics and more about the meaning of representation itself. The question hung in the air: who gets to belong in America's halls of power? Crockett's answer was simple, defiant, and profoundly democratic. Everyone. She tied her composure to the struggles that preceded her, to every civil rights marcher who faced jeers on Southern streets, to every woman told her voice was too shrill, to every immigrant whose accent was mocked as un-American. Her calm response was not silence. It was the echo of generations who had carried themselves with dignity, even when dignity was denied. And this was why her words resonated beyond partisan lines. Because at its core, the confrontation wasn't about Democrats or Republicans. It wasn't about left versus right. It was about the soul of democracy itself. A system cannot claim legitimacy if it silences some voices while amplifying others. America, at its best, is not built on exclusion. It is strengthened by inclusion. The lesson was clear: arrogance can win a moment, but dignity wins the future. Representation is not a privilege to be granted by gatekeepers. It is a right, owned by every American who dares to stand and speak. Crockett's reply crystallized that truth into a line that would be remembered long after the chamber emptied. And perhaps that is why the moment felt so electric, so unforgettable. Because it wasn't just about one senator silencing another. It was about reclaiming the narrative of who belongs in America and reminding the nation that belonging is not something you beg for. It is something you claim by standing your ground. Her words lingered not only in news cycles, but in the hearts of those who had been told, "You don't belong here," in 1,000 different ways. She had turned insult into anthem, attack into affirmation, arrogance into accountability. And this is why the story didn't end in that chamber. Rand Paul may have screamed, "You don't belong here," but Jasmine Crockett proved, in front of the nation, that belonging is not his to grant or deny. Her calm, devastating reply didn't just silence arrogance in that chamber, it echoed across the country, reminding millions that dignity will always outlast rage. This was never just about one exchange. It was about the kind of America we choose to build. An America where representation is not questioned, but celebrated. Where arrogance cannot shout down accountability. Where every voice, regardless of race, gender, or origin, belongs in the story of democracy. Moments like this are why people tune in, why they share, why they remember. Because in a world that often rewards bluster, it's powerful to witness composure win the day. Crockett's words stand as proof that truth does not need to scream, it only needs to stand firm. And now, the story is in your hands. If you believe truth outshines arrogance, share this video. If you believe belonging matters more than exclusion, share this video. And if you believe dignity will always silence hate, then subscribe and join us in amplifying the voices rewriting history. This is More Than Commentary. It's a movement. And with every share, every subscription, every conversation sparked, you become part of it. Because in America, no voice belongs more than another. And together, we can make sure the echoes of dignity grow louder than the shouts of arrogance. So, join us. Subscribe, share, and let the world know. History is rewritten not by those who scream the loudest, but by those who stand with the most dignity.